Time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here. These are shows that we do every single day at 3:30 here at the Headwaters Science Center, where we just talk about different topics related to different types of science. And so tune in one day, we might be talking about some birds. Tune in next week, we'll probably be talking about something else. And so today, what I'm going to be doing is kind of a follow-up show to the shows from the last couple days, where if you watched yesterday, you saw Angie bringing out the owl and talking a little bit about imprinting with Oswald, our great horned owl here. And the day before that, Lee, our executive director, pulled a few books out and was doing some reading with those. And so I have kind of two books here that Lee read on Wednesday. So if you want to get the full script on these, you can see our video on Wednesday. It's up on YouTube. But these two books in particular, a couple of pages in this one, particularly just like this intro page here, kind of struck me as being kind of interesting. So this book's about a rooster that goes around town, keeps making a bunch of noise, but this kind of intro page here, it shows our rooster that is our star of our show, but it also has another chicken back here. And I was kind of struck by the difference in how these two chickens look from one another, which got me thinking about, maybe that's a good thing to talk about, is why would those two chickens of the same species, and they're actually even on the cover too, look so different from one another? And this one, kind of following up with it, was very much about coloration with the animals too, where this one is kind of a more fantastical book where the animals in this one aren't even alive within the book. They're a drawing that gets ink spilled all over them, and they're very concerned about it. And so why would you be, if you're a chicken or any other animal, very concerned that, like, oops, my color all of a sudden changed? Which got me thinking about things like pigmentation and why certain animals look the way they do. And so you'll see I have surrounding me here a bunch of different birds. And I think just to start, since we talked about great horned owls yesterday, we'll bring over my two great horned owl mounts that I've got here. And you'll notice that these two great horned owls actually do look a little bit different from one another. And this is something that, might strike you as interesting, is that we have these two great horned owls, same species, but they're just kind of different colors, a little bit different patterns from one another. And so what is the process that results in that? Why would that happen? And so seeing stuff like this, where you have two animals that are the same species but look very different from one another just on like a color basis, is something that a lot of the times you see, in particular with animals that have a very, very big wild range. And so great horned owls are an awesome example of that. Great horned owls are a species you can find pretty much throughout all of North America. And so what happens when you're an animal that has a really, really big range like that is that the camouflage needs from one part of your range to a different part of your range are going to be different. So if you're a great horned owl from, way up in Canada, your camouflage needs are going to be different than if you're a great horned owl from, down in Texas. And so you'll see animals that have big ranges like that, like I said, have a lot more variation in their appearances than animals that exist in a really concise little tight area. And you can see a couple animals that we have on the exhibit floor here at the Headwaters Science Center that kind of experience this the same way. Corn snakes are a great example of another animal that come in a bunch of different colors and patterns because their range in the wild is huge. Even the legless lizards, we have two of those that are very different colors, and those are both naturally occurring colors for those legless lizards, and they have that because, like I said, they have a really big range stretching from Central Europe all the way out into almost Central Asia. And so, like I said, it's based around camouflage needs. This bird is a lot more effective at hiding in its environment than this bird is, and vice versa. But this isn't something that you necessarily just see with animals that have big ranges, where you see animals that are the same species that look very different from one another. So I have, and these guys are going to come back in a second here, a couple of examples where we are seeing two animals that are the same species that do look very different from one another, but that's not the reason why. And so this one right here is probably like the most iconic one for this area. Like when I think of sexual dimorphism, this is an animal that immediately comes up to me, and that word I use is sexual dimorphism. So those are ways that the males and females of a species will look different from one another. And I think this is a good topic to talk about with birds because you see a lot of it in birds, and you see a lot of very apparent sexual dimorphism in birds in a way that you don't necessarily see with a ton of other animals. And so these guys are mallard ducks. Like I said, a duck you'll see around northern Minnesota, around Bemidji, just all the time. And with these guys, we got a couple of pheasants here where you got the male and the female. And one of the things you might notice here is that in both cases, you have a female that is relatively drab brown coloration. And then you have the males that are much more showy. In this case, they both have these, green heads, and he's got some little flare on his wings over here. And if you, I don't know how well this will pick up on the camera, but you can see there's this kind of sheen, this gloss to the neck, and even the tail feathers are very kind of showy in a way that they really aren't with the female. They're much longer, they're a different color. And so the question you're probably having is, well, why do that? Like, what's the benefit of going either direction with this? And before we go into that, you got to kind of understand this idea of natural selection. And so natural selection is an idea you've probably heard of before. It's a concept that, you're going to learn in school if you haven't already, where basically traits in an animal that are more likely to result in it reproducing are more likely to be passed on. And so if an animal dies before it can reproduce, it's not going to have an opportunity to pass its traits on. And so the more beneficial traits, the more likely that animal is to make it first to sexual maturity and then actually reproduce, the more likely its physical traits are to manifest in the next generation, basically. And so what you see here is you have females that have pretty good camouflage. Like, this is great patternation, great coloration for like hiding, for not getting found by predators and eaten. Like, that's what these guys are built for. Which, of course, results in the follow-up question of, well, why don't the males just look the same way then? If, these guys are built to survive out in the wild, how come these guys aren't? And I kind of hinted at it just a second ago, but there's an element of this of, you got to survive to sexual maturity. You got to survive to be old enough to actually reproduce. But then you actually got to find a mate and actually reproduce too. And as is the case with a lot of animals, as is with these guys, you get what's called sexual selection that happens, where basically animals with certain traits are more likely to basically be picked as mates. So it's not necessarily being driven by survival, it's being driven by how picky potential mates are. And so things like, all this showy coloration, basically the lady ducks and the lady pheasants think that looks good, and so they pick ones that look like this, they pick mates that look like this, and as a result, you see it more in subsequent generations. It's kind of a weird line that you gotta ride, though, where, if you go too showy, go too ostentatious, you're probably not gonna survive to adulthood to reproduce anyway. And so what you see, basically, is, like I said, a bunch of males that are showy to an extent, but like I said, if you go too crazy, you'll probably get killed and eaten before you ever get a chance to reproduce anyway. The other element of this is you'll see, and I want to phrase this. So the coloration you'll see the coloration change with certain animals over time as well, like within a lifespan, I mean. So like a lot of times you'll see that like the babies of a certain species will look a certain way, and then once they reach adulthood, once they reach that sexual maturity state, then all of a sudden you see the coloration shift over. So a great example that we see around Minnesota are bald eagles, where the bald eagles look a certain way, and then once they reach maturity, they get a white head. Young bald eagles don't have the white head, they're just brown all the way through, because the white isn't really advantageous for them as far as their survival. It's advantageous for them as far as finding mates, basically. And so before they need to find a mate, there's not really any reason to have it. And so what you see is, like I said, young eagles looking different than older eagles. And like I said, that's kind of a subset within natural selection. Like I said, it's mate selection, and you see this with a lot of animals. And typically what you see is that the males tend to be the ones that have the like traits that are disadvantageous for survival. The traits that are like showy and more likely to get you seen tends to be the way it goes. I honestly can't even really think of a species off the top of my head where the females are really like bright and showy in a way that probably gets them spotted more often than predators. And the main reason for that is basically in a species that does sexual reproduction, the females bear a lot more of the burden. Like, egg cells are way more expensive than sperm cells are. It's a much bigger physiological burden to like carry eggs or a baby within you for an extended period of time. And so typically the ones who are like selecting the mate are the females, because like I said, it's more expensive on the reproductive end for a female. So they're the ones who are making the picking, and the male's got to be showy to be picked. one thing that's interesting, we bring out my great horned owls again. Great horned owls have a relatively low amount of sexual dimorphism between the males and the females. We talked about the differences that these two exhibit, but we talked about it in the context of being from different parts of a very big range. Great horned owls that live in the same area, for the most part, don't exhibit this. They mostly just look the same. The females tend to be bigger than the males, but as far as like a weird showy plumage, it's like not really a thing with great horned owls or a lot of other species to like have this weird coloration difference. And the tendency with that, like the kind of halfway decent predictor you have with that, is basically species that pair off for life tend to exhibit relatively low amounts of dimorphism, whereas ones that are having to pick mates, new mates every year, or ones that are probably having multiple mates in a given year, you tend to see this big dimorphism that happens where the males get more and more ostentatious. Basically, the more females they reproduce with, kind of is the deal. And so, like I said, with owls, where you tend to have one male, one female that shack up for life together, you just got to get picked once and then you're good to go. And so you tend to not see this huge investment in, a big peacock tail when you're an owl. Because like I said, the benefit of it just isn't there quite as much. And now, like I said, these are all different means of what we call natural selection. So you have natural selection that creates a bias just as far as like surviving to be old enough to actually reproduce. And you have natural selection that creates a bias as far as successfully reproducing once you reach sexual maturity. But natural selection isn't the only type of selection out there. There's also what we would call artificial selection. And artificial selection means that some quote-unquote unnatural source has been dictating who is able to breed with whom. And so typically this is going to be humans. And so this is something that you'll see referred to like artificial selection. You can think of something like our rabbits that we have here at the Headwaters Science Center are artificially selected. They don't look like they would out in the wild because they have a bunch of traits for them that are not selected for survival or reproduction. They're selected for to be cute by humans. Another great example are bearded dragons. And so we have our two bearded dragons here at the Headwaters Science Center. What you might notice is that they are pretty different colors. They are not the same color. This one here, relatively close to like the coloration you would see out in the wild. Yeah, puffing his beard out. Kind of this tannish, brownish kind of color. Good camouflage color. It's pretty standard. You could throw that next to it and be like, yeah, that's a wild living thing. It camouflages out in the wild. This guy, on the other hand, is very different. He's got this bright yellow color. You can see the orange around his eyes. You can see he's puffing his beard out right now. But that's something that you would not see in a wild bearded dragon. Because that's a color that's like not going to be good camouflage for him. That's something that's going to get him eaten before he probably ever reaches adulthood. Something that would have gotten his ancestors eaten before they had a chance to reproduce and make him. And so you, like I said, basically don't see this type of thing in the wild, but you do see it relatively commonly in the pet trade. Because, like I said, they're being artificially selected for. They're being protected from predators, so they don't have to worry about predators. And they're probably even being deliberately mated with each other in order to make this happen faster. And so this is something that you pretty much exclusively see with things that like humans have domesticated. So like I said, the rabbits we have here at the Science Center are a great example. The bearded dragons are a great example. Our corn snake is one that is absolutely not a wild color that you would see for our corn snake. She's been specifically bred via artificial selection to look the way she does. And so, like I say, you can see there are certain dimorphisms that still happen naturally, even in these like kind of artificially selected for critters, where like specifically things like size, where you'll have the male bearded dragons tend to be bigger than the females and things like that. But as far as things like color, like he's been very specifically bred to look this way, like, and that's operating under a different process than like the dimorphism we're seeing with our pheasants or our owls, for example. So I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about today. you got any questions about this, feel free to throw them in comments on Facebook or YouTube. I tend to cruise through those and check them every once in a while. Otherwise, thank you all for watching. The Headwaters Science Center is open from 9:30 to 5 Monday through Saturday, and from 1 to 5 on Sundays, so you can swing by anytime during those hours. If you come by at 3:30, we'll probably be doing one of these shows out on the exhibit floor here. If you're regular watchers, you might have encountered this, where we'll have, a lot of raucous happening around us because people are out on the floor, and sometimes we have a live audience here. And having a live audience is fun for me, so if you are here at 3:30, absolutely come up and watch. I like having an audience to bounce off of. It makes it a lot more engaging on my end, as much as I love my internet audience. But otherwise, tomorrow, I actually don't know what the show is going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow's Saturday. It's not Snake Day tomorrow. Oh, something else. We'll see. It'll be a surprise for you, just like it'll be a surprise for me. But anyway, thank you all for watching.